Good morning, everybody. Distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, friends, colleagues, welcome to day 2 of the Doha Forum. I hope you thought yesterday was as dynamic as I believe it was. We have a lot to live up to after yesterday, and I promise we will deliver. You are going to hear from some of the world's most remarkable thinkers, leaders, and advocates who are here to have a discussion on some potential solutions for some of the world's biggest problems. I would like to give you some highlights for the day, just so you can make appointments to be back in this room, hopefully. So at 10 o'clock this morning, the inspiring 2018 Nobel Prize laureate, Nadia Murad, will be here. You do not want to miss that. At 11:15, also in this room, the Foreign Minister of Turkey. We trust he will make some news and answer some very challenging questions. And then to end the day, at 5:45, one of the world's most impressive and influential leaders, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. So hopefully you will all stick around for all of that. I'm going to invite the participants of the first panel to make their way to the stage now so that we can get started. In the meantime, I'm going to thank our sponsors. Of course, that would be Qatar Petroleum, Qatar National Bank, and our telecommunications sponsor, Ooredoo. So our first panelists, we are about, as you can see, the gentlemen now are making, nudge, nudge, are making their way to the stage. So to introduce the discussion, which will be on international prospects for international trade and investment, CNN Business Emerging Markets editor John Defterios, and he will introduce his panel. Gentlemen, take it away.
Rochelle, before you leave the stage, I had a question for you. Where's that accent from?
Texas.
You're Texas?
Yes.
Good. Texas to Doha. That's a long trip. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning to everyone. I'm glad to see that everybody came up fast and early. Let me introduce the rest of our panelists first, and then I'll give a brief introduction to our debate for the next hour. This is a very important debate because it deals right at the heart of the subject of populism and the relationship to the multilateral trade organizations that we have around the world in free trade and the lifeblood of free trade going forward. Let's give a warm welcome to His Excellency Ali bin Ahmed Al Kuwari. He's the Minister of Commerce and Industry for the state of Qatar, and prior to that, Chief Executive Officer of Qatar National Bank. And the one who organized this panel. We're greatly appreciative of you having us. Dr. Volker Treyers, Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce, second in the center here. And someone I've had a chance to debate over the last couple of decades when it comes to trade, Dr. Stefan Gorelli, Professor Emeritus of the World Competitiveness at IMD and Professor at the University of Lausanne, shares his time between Geneva and Lausanne. So we have about 50 minutes just to manage expectations here. We're going to take questions for the last 10 minutes from the floor, and I think there's numbers with the microphones. We'll try to get a couple of microphones up and ready so we don't lose time. I would just ask during the period of the question and answer session that you keep it brief, identify yourself, and direct the question to one of those on the panel. Your Excellency, this is the site of the Doha Development Round and the agenda that followed to advance the World Trade Organization and the GATT round that finished, and something I had a chance to cover. It was a very critical window because at the time when they closed the GATT round and they launched the World Trade Organization, in the West, the biggest concern was that the United States would swamp Europe with its cultural exports, movies and music, and there was no concern at the time about opening up to China, India, Southeast Asia, and competition from Africa and Latin America, lower cost competition. It seems that people didn't think this through in the West. What were the implications of opening up in such a radical way? Is that why we see the populism today, that perhaps Western governments, and I think this is a good question for all of the panel, didn't prepare their populations for the competition that they opened themselves up to in 1990, 1991, and there onwards? Is that a fair comment? And let's grab your microphone here. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I mean, if we look what's happening today, especially if we can go particularly to France, the yellow vest movement, I think you're right. I think this is the easy answer. But what's happening, here, I think we need to look to the WTO. We should not look at it as, fixed rules or regulations that cannot be changed over years. And this is the idea. I mean, when you have the open trade and the free trade, it's not meant to be like forever rules. And the world is changing. The world is evolving. The movement from, from what do you call it, mass economy to knowledge economy. I mean, this is it was seen there, but at the same time, I think what happened, all the rules was meant to be more like, to support capitalism, and the trade around that one. It's very important, I think, now for really to revisit and look to the current regulations, because the idea of the WTO and the free trade is to be fair to everybody and to create a fair playing field and competitiveness for everybody. So looking at this, I think it's very important that we always have the evolving of the WTO rules and regulations, and it becomes much easier than, to do this rather than, thinking like this is not the right rules and this is the right regulations, and let me break certain rules of the WTO, or let me exit, the treaty as a whole. And the idea here, I'm going back, and again, if I can expand a little bit, I'm moving away from a WTO, a free trade and competition, platform, into a localism and socialism. I think this is not the right way. We need always to have. It's a very good platform. It's one of the Doha development agenda, as you mentioned yourself, was a big revolution in terms of like, getting so many people accepting, the rules and regulations and really moving into a different level of agreements. So we should not lose this. But that's the idea here. Just we need to always build on this, as we go forward. It's an excellent platform, but we need to revive it all the time. This is the idea. And education, of course, education is very important. I think many countries, they were successful. Looking to my friend, Volker here to my left, Germany did a good job in terms of, educating the German, people about, and having them ready for it. But the idea is here is very important. Not only educating, but also involving the people in these decisions going forward. It's very important, and it has to be looked at, what do you call it, from a long-term sustainable model rather than looking at it from a short-term. Because short-term gains, does not, okay, fine, you will win in 1 or 2 years, but what's going to happen after that?
Okay, that's a good place to leap off. Let's bring in Professor Gorelli, and then I'll circle back to Dr. Volker. Is the WTO nimble enough to reform? Because the minister brought up a very good point. You don't want to throw out the World Trade Organization, although some like President Trump, I would think the Brexit vote even indicates that people are, there's a backlash to globalization. But is it capable of reforming with that size of a membership to establish the rules for the 21st century that the minister's talking about, Professor?
I think, John, there is no alternative than to reform itself. I think what we are saying with the Brexit, what we are saying with the Trump administration is actually one very strong message. It's not that easy to get out of the global system. It's not that easy to disentangle yourself from the global value chain and the globalization of the economy. One of the interesting aspects, and you mentioned, Your Excellency, the Yellow Vest movement in France, is that actually we have been very bad at telling people what globalization is all about. I think a lot of people are still living in a very local world. They do not understand really what is globalization all about, and we didn't tell them some very simple facts, such as if you can buy an iPhone at such a price, if it would be manufactured completely in the United States of America or in your local country, it would be 3 times as expensive. Is it really what you want? So we are really in a world which is very localized in certain part of the world. In the United States, it would be in the middle of the country. And then we have some people who are very global. But I think the biggest issue we have is that we didn't tell people what globalization is all about. We have a lot of people still who are thinking in terms of zero-sum game. If one country gains, the other is losing. And I think it is very dangerous, and it's all our fault. We didn't tell the people, that they have an advantage in being in a global world. And this is what we are seeing with all these manifestations in France and elsewhere.
Okay, let's take the German model, Dr. Trier, and the ability to have an apprenticeship program. Lived off and on in the UK over the last 30 years, and the number one complaint you hear is the Polish plumber, and now it's evolved to the Romanian immigrant that's working in construction or the Bulgarian players. So managing migration is part of it, but the German apprenticeship program, which has actually been enhanced since the signing of the WTO agreement, makes a huge difference, right? Because different sectors of society are not cut out. Isn't that the role that Professor Gorelli is talking about as well? It's part education in terms of telling people what's ahead, but having the building blocks of training for those to have jobs to compete in the global economy.
Thank you for bringing into the discussion the German apprenticeship program, because in former times it seems such a tiny instrument of what could be or could have been the strength of German economy, and nowadays it's very popular, at least in discussions. But it's a good example when it comes to the question to maybe to explain why we live in a paradox world. I do think that the WTO is almost 25 years old, and a lot has changed in that time. These 25 years have brought tremendous welfare to many people in the world against the backdrop of a dramatic demographic change in major parts of the world. So it delivered jobs and welfare to many people. And one explanation is the existence of the WTO. But things have changed nevertheless. That does not mean that the WTO has not the necessity in order to reform major parts. But what has happened, why do we live in a paradox world? I would say we should live in automation, digitalization, globalization. Instead, we live in a world, at least the year 2018, and expectedly also the next year in populism, nationalism, and protectionism, what we as internationally oriented economy are very much complaining about. So the WTO acts as a scapegoat for shortfalls which are the responsibility in order to overcome those shortfalls and shortcomings is in the national governments and not in multilateral organizations. The multilateral organization like the WTO is not responsible for implementing a apprenticeship program like what we have. Yeah? So why are people complaining in the USA, and what has led to what we are experiencing right now, these trade conflicts and the policy of Donald Trump? Let's face it.
Let's bring this forward then. Is it education? Is this the missing piece of the puzzle? The reason I brought up the German apprenticeship program, because it's training for those who plan not to go for an advanced education.
That's one explanation, or it could be one instrument in order to overcome this unease towards globalization. The yellow vests, they take another scapegoat. This is the European Union. Yeah? And the European Union is not the fault of European Union, which has led to some unease among major parts of the French population.
I'm going to challenge you on that a little bit, though, because the European Union decided to expand rapidly. And Professor Gorelli, I'd love to get your thoughts, and then His Excellency the Minister to chime in as well, because there's a role for smaller states to protect globalism, right? This is a very important point, but let's bring it up in follow-up. Well, some would argue the European Union was tone deaf to its populism that was there. There was a real fear of expanding too fast to Eastern Europe, and it's a mistake to do so without the support of your citizens. That's a fair criticism, is it not?
I don't believe so, because there are so many advantages and benefits of this Eastern enlargement of the European Union. And it's also in the national responsibility of EU member states in order to exploit the potential benefits of having the enlargement or not. So if you, in Germany, for instance, we carried out a reform package at 15 years ago. This was really painful. It's the so-called Agenda 2010. It was painful, but it paid off. And in combination with the Eastern enlargement, today, German business, I cannot think about without having in mind that we have established value chains with the plants in Central and Eastern Europe. Yeah? There is no German business anymore. It's more or less a Central European business, including the plants and all created a lot of jobs and bringing social security and all that stuff into countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic.
Excellent point. But again, it needs to be sold to the people what we're doing. You'd agree with that,
We
Professor?
need leadership.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, of course, you may realize that for a Swiss to speak about the European Union is something a little bit strange. But on the other hand, I think it's very important to realize one thing. If you look at the 27 countries in the European Union, there are only 6 or 7 large countries. The vast majority are smaller nations. And I'm sure that Your Excellency, you will comment on the importance of smaller nations in the world. But I think this is exactly it. It's not only difficult to sell it to the people themselves, it's also difficult to sell it to the government of smaller nations. And if I take my country, Switzerland, we have been debating, like Norway and other countries, whether we should join or not. And when you try to speak to the people, they will say, oh yes, but if we are joining, we are going to be swallowed up by the French and the German, I'm sorry. We are going to be 50% of the GDP of Europe. And I think in the world of today, we have to be much more careful about the smaller nations, much more careful about the local opinion. And I'm not going to say it's your fault on the media, but if you are looking at the US...
We take our fair share of criticism at CNN and America.
If you are looking at the US, how many people are looking at the national channels? Very few. I mean, you get your information in the Midwest from the local TV and the local newspapers, and that's it. And that's why we have this huge gap between globalization and the smaller nations and the local people who are seeing a totally different world. And it does explain, in my opinion, all the problems we are seeing today where people are feeling that they have been left behind because nobody cared about them. We spoke about globalization, but I always say a big tree needs big roots. And you need still to have the roots inside your country. Because there are so many organizations, so many companies who said, I'm global, and I'm forgetting about my national environment. The moment you say that, you are dead.
Okay, let's bring up this idea of the smaller states, Minister. It's fascinating. If I look at Singapore and its population of about 5, it punches well above its weight. I've interviewed Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, the ruler of Dubai, and he said, look, we are the most globalized economy in the world. We would die without globalization. And I think it's a fair comparison to Doha. I mean, it's a small state that punches above its weight, but you need the global connectivity to survive. Is it correct?
Well, there is no right or wrong answer for this, and it's very important. I think both models are working, but it's now it's becoming a small world, and no single country can live in its own. And we need everybody. Whether now we go into some sort of a treaties, whether geographical treaties, for countries around you, or we go with different kind of treaties based on in certain sectors. And we have seen both models. I mean, as you mentioned, Switzerland is a good model. The European Union is a good model. And we have seen the NAFTA, we have seen the ASEAN, we have seen these economical blocks, around us. And they've done very well, and even they are working within the umbrella itself of the WTO. But I mean, looking to the smaller nation, I think it's very important. And looking to Qatar, for example, we are in a special situation. We are into a blockade by 18 months. We have done so wonderful, in the last 18 months. Our economy has grown up, in terms of our GDP, $222 billion versus 218, which is 1.7% up. Our trade volume went up by 16%, to $103 billion, during the blockade. And we have achieved so much during, this 18 months, which we were not able to achieve if we were in a normal situation, Look, you're looking to a country, that was dependent on the land route from Saudi Arabia. 95% of that route was responsible for food and medicine, while the other 90% coming from Jabal Ali, from a transit and a trade point of view. And over a year and a half, this completely changed, and we were able to grow it. So it's very important, that I'm not saying like a small nation, but you really need always to work differently, and you need to have the diversification. You need to be able to build the relationship with the countries, and this is what we're achieving. Like looking to Doha port, for example. Doha port, before, or I should say Hamad port, before the blockade, we had only 7 maritime routes. Now 27 maritime routes, direct routes. Also the capacity have been increased from 58% utilization to 87% utilization of our Doha port. Doha International Airport, Hamad International Airport, 50 million passengers capacity a year, So we have done so much, during this 18 months, and this is what I'm saying, it's very important, that you need to always, think from the national interest point of view. But globalization is very important. You cannot be alone. There is no country in the world can live alone.
This is a very important lesson.
Singapore, going back to Singapore, Singapore is a good model.
No, but I was curious. Did you use the Singapore model?
Absolutely. It's a good model, and we see that. They have done so much. They are, looking to their neighboring places like, Malaysia, which is a much bigger country, China, and everything. And despite all of that, they really run very well, and they were able to achieve. And the idea behind it, not only but building the right relationship with the world, opening to the world, and in the same time also they need to think beyond, the normal thinking, for in terms of trade, and also building the routes and building themselves as a reliable and credible partner. It's very important, the reliability and credibility, among these ones, because you mentioned Dubai, but Dubai to me it's not a credible model. Looking to what happened during the blockade, do you think this is a credible model? It's not a credible model. If I am an international,
you wouldn't argue with the fact that Dubai is a very globalized economy.
Globalized,
and it's had
but
its
not
trade
credible.
port, right? No, I'm not saying about the economic embargo, but its model is based on being global, correct?
Yes. But if you need to be global, you need to be credible. You need to be a reliable partner. You need to be really trustful. You cannot break contracts, just overnights and over day. And
absolutely correct.
This is the idea.
Great. The other thing, can I follow up, as I don't want to get stuck in the weeds of the embargo, but was it an interesting lesson for you that you created opportunity outside the GCC, and one would argue that Qatar was quite complacent having these relationships with the Gulf states, and this created an opportunity because of the globalized model, right? You could find new partners for Qatar.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have done a lot, we have achieved a lot, we have learned a lot, during the blockade. Actually, what has been achieved in the 18 months would take us normally 20 or 30 years to achieve this. And this is not new, by the way, because this is part of our Qatar Vision 2030. But we saw opportunities to accelerate certain elements of our vision and to make it happen, much earlier than when it should have. And our thinking has changed because now we are more global, we are more open to the world, we are more reliable in terms of reaching to everybody. And this has been received, very good by the international community. So globalization is very important, and also, the national interest is very important. Both they have to work hand in hand. I think it's very important. You cannot have one over another.
Absolutely. Before we move on, because there's a couple of key sectors I would like to bring up, but for the purposes of understanding, are you planning for this blockade to be lifted? Do you think there can be a solution to the economic blockade realistically, or is it just a lot of lip service? I saw the invitation to His Highness the Emir to go to the GCC summit, but it seemed to be like a sugar coating and nothing realistic below it. What's your perspective?
Well, it's very difficult to assess what's going to happen, in this blockade. But Qatar position has been very clear. We're open to dialogue. We're open to discussions, and in a fair and in a fair manner, and has to be with respect to each country's sovereignty. So this has been our message, and our message is consistent. His Highness the Emir yesterday he reiterated the same message in his speech. So we'll let this aside. But for us, we have come a long way, and really to a point where really, I would not say I don't care, but really, whether this blockade lifted tomorrow or day after tomorrow, a year later, 2 years later, 10 years later, we're okay, we're fine. Actually, we're better.
You're more competitive, you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have come a long way, and really, we have achieved a lot, and we'll be achieving much more as we continue. It's not I'm saying, the blockade, I like the blockade to continue. Of course, this is not, but if it continues, we're okay.
Okay, Professor Gorelli, please.
I think there is something in common. In general, the smaller nations are highly competitive globally, but they are not very powerful from a political point of view. And this is a problem of Dubai, of Singapore, of everybody, including my country, Switzerland. And I think sooner or later we will have to consider the possibility of making an alliance of the smaller nations. We start to see that happening in Europe now with the Baltic state, the Baltic Alliance, with the Nordic countries. And when you look at the world, I mean, the smaller nations, if they want to be heard politically, sooner or later they will have to get together and make a kind of a group or an alliances of the smaller nations.
I've never heard that before. That's a very interesting idea.
I have been saying that for many years, but without any success, so don't worry. But I think that maybe, Your Excellency, you can think about a Doha Forum on the smaller nations, just because if we don't get together, we have no chance in face of the United States of America, China, or our friends of Germany, well, our friends. We have no chance. And the only way we can have our voice be heard is if we are getting together.
It's actually a pretty good idea. Maybe it should be on the agenda for next year. Dr. Trier.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But just want to throw in that in Europe, there can be only one Switzerland. The Baltics are different. They are part of the European Union. Singapore has its position due to the fact that there is an enormous, what we call hinterland. Yeah? There are enormous other countries who are doing another job in the division of labor in order to produce global goods. And that shows us how interconnected we are. And there are certainly different positions of different countries in this position. Yeah? Look at the German car produced or sold in Germany to any country in the world consists, when it is sold from Germany, then it consists of 60% of added value coming from abroad. Most of the parts coming from Central Eastern European countries, yeah, due to the single market. That means globalization. And in the USA, for instance, the greatest net exporter of cars, when you compare the brands, is a German brand. It's BMW.
So a German car coming from the United States being exported to the world is what you're saying.
Being exported to the world and being exported to China. Well, that's very interesting, and not the other way around. So therefore, from our business point of view, from Germany, it does not make sense what is happening right now as an instrument in order to overcome the unease towards globalization stemming from the USA.
Well, let's follow this up with Professor Gorelli.
Yeah.
One of the proposals by President Trump is to put tariffs on German cars. How do you define a German car today? Would it be a car that's exported from Germany to the United States? Or how about the ones that are made in the southern United States, as Dr. Trier was just talking about? It doesn't square in a globalized world to try to put tariffs on a German car.
Actually, it's very true. One of the biggest problems we have today is to simply define where a product is coming from. What is really the nationality of a product? I mean, you mentioned the German car. You could have said in Spartanburg, I think it's Tennessee or one of these places.
South Carolina.
South Carolina, I'm sorry, John. South Carolina, BMW is manufacturing cars there and exporting them from the US to China. Am I correct? So this is quite unique, and actually if you take an iPhone, it's going into the United States of America and it is labeled as a Chinese product because it is assembled in the southern part of China, near Shenzhen. But actually only 4 to 5% of the added value of the iPhone is Chinese. All the rest is coming from all over the world. So today, we know that about 42% of the export from China to the US are actually made by American companies. And it is 45% of the export from Mexico into the US are made by American companies because the value chain is totally global. And again, I think this is very important that today when you start to put tariffs on those kind of products, you are shooting yourself in the foot because you are also putting tariffs on your own companies who are manufacturing abroad in a global environment. It's again what I have said. I mean, it is such a world of globalization. To get out of it, to disentangle it is terrible. And the next point, and I'm sure we are going to discuss it, the big issue is that now those protectionist measures are not made on job protection, as it used to be the case in the past with the WTO or GATT. You said, I'm losing my job, I need to protect my business. Now it's made on the concept of national security. And this is a 1962 Trade Expansion Act in the US, which was at the origin of the protection measures on aluminum and steel. But if you have national protectionism, national security as a way of protectionism, you open a completely different debate. What is the definition of really national security? Everything can be national security, and every country can have a different definition of it. How do you want to have a debate at the WTO when you have a problem if people say, hold it, it's not a question of job, it's a question of national security. And you close the debate there, and everybody goes back home. And this is a real issue today.
We even see it here in the region, Your Excellency?
I mean, yes, we have a live example actually here. We have seen, countries infringing the copyrights and the TV rights of our channel, PN Sport, and based on national interest or national defense reasons, so we've seen the Be Out channel coming out of Saudi Arabia. This is, and copying our BN rights, who paid, billions of dollars to achieve these rights, and you just copy it over, and then when you go to WTO to complain, then this is, well, for national defense reasons. So don't worry. I mean, we see a live example here as well of this one.
But how do we square, Dr. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. But and this is really, I think, what we want to, think about here. It's very important that we build, a strong respect for the regulations and the rules, really of the agreements we sign. The WTO, most of the countries, or almost all the countries, are part of it, and they are not respecting the rules and regulations because somebody wakes up one day and says, okay, it does not work out for me, or there is, something I don't like about this agreement. We have to really be bounded by the rules. This is one thing. And the other thing, we have to also create a strong arbitral, a platform where we can really solve disputes for these ones. And these platforms has to be strong enough and fast enough to take decisions where people can see the consequences.
That's an excellent point you're saying, though, and I think it's worth stopping you on that. You said, one, you have to have the rules that can't be broken. What's the penalty? Because a lot of people don't think the WTO penalty is strong enough. And then the other criticism that President Trump has said is that the WTO is far too slow. But I don't think it's a real fair criticism.
I have my view on this one. I think the dispute and the arbitrational platform for WTO needs to be improved in terms of speed, in terms of being effective, and consequences. It's very important. I think because what's going to happen, if here people are going to infringe rights of other members, and then you have to wait 5 or 6 years to get even a judgment, and even with that judgment you don't know whether it's going to go through or not. We need to, and this is really, I think, one of the things is very important, really, where people, and it should not be an option like, okay, I don't like the rules, I just exit it. It should not be an easy exit even for these ones. There should be consequences for the exit itself. And this is one of the things, I think, if we are looking to the WTO as a good platform and evolving platform, this is one of the things that should be changing.
Well, you made a profound statement when we were having a tea in our green room discussion before coming onto the stage. Is there a real threat today that the world moves on without the United States? I know it's almost impossible because of the scale and the size of the U.S. economy, but because of the rule breaking that we see today and the threat of building a wall with on the border with Mexico and tearing up NAFTA, sort of tearing it up, it wasn't really a reality, but that the U.S. is isolated. Is the world strong enough, and I'd love to hear our other two panelists suggest this as well, is the world strong enough to stand up to the United States and say, we don't want your model? And Chancellor Merkel said, we can bend to the United States, but we're not going to break. What's your view? And then let's get the views of the rest of the panel.
Well, I think there is an increased pressure. There is no doubt there is increased pressure, around the world, really, to build, maybe, what do you call it, economical blocks or new economical alliances and blocks, itself, to deal with the situation like, the trade war and the trade, tension has been happening recently. And this is the only thing I would think about, going forward, when you start breaking these blocks or interconnecting certain blocks and even having certain countries, even Russia itself. We've been talking about China, EU, and even Russia. Russia is an important economic bloc. It's one of the biggest producers of hydrocarbon in the world, and they have, strong manufacturing. So if we start seeing, creating, I mean, this, because what's going to happen, to defeat, these actions, I think people will start rethinking about their blocks and how can be united again. The issue here, once this thing goes far away, it's going to be very difficult to come back. And this is, I think, one of the risks for countries like USA, though I think should look at, because you don't want to be pushing people to start, creating economic blocks, even outside the traditional ones has been, existing here. So it's very important. I mean, as I said, globalization is extremely important for everybody, whether you are a small country or you are a big country or you are part of a bloc. It's very important because we are living under one roof at the end of the day.
Great. Professor Gorelli and Dr. Trier, please.
I think the big risk if we drop the multilateral world is to go into a world of what I would call warlords, where we are going to have basically 4 big warlords: the United States of America, China, Russia, of course, and Europe. And all these 4 big powers will have their own regional agreement with smaller nations around them, like the former NAFTA agreement with the US, like the Trans-Pacific program with China, like many other things in Europe, etc. And this is a big risk, that we have these 4 large blocs which are fighting with each other on the global world, and then they establish their own backyard agreements with many smaller nations. And I think this is a huge risk because, I mean, for the smaller nations, we are going to be crunched out of the system with this. But we are going into this direction. When President Trump is saying something that the others do not like, the only one who are being able to negotiate today is China, is Europe, and it's Russia, and nobody else. And we don't find any negotiation at the WTO or elsewhere. So I think this is a risk where we are going. Now, the only optimistic approach I could say that let's keep in mind, President Trump is going to be there for the next 2 or 6 years, but no more. So there will be maybe a world after him. And I think we should also keep this perspective that at a certain level of time, and I mean, we may go back into this multilateral world.
I would like to add one remark on the question of national defense reasons or national security. I mean, I do think it's legitimate to say to protect some parts of your economy in order to protect national defense objectives. And we have to work on the issue of national security in digital times even more scrutinized than we did before. In a digital world, we have to talk about critical infrastructure and the question how to work with it in order that your own country, that your own society, that your own economic union is not dependent maybe on another major player in the world. Keyword is reciprocity. But so we have to work on that also on a WTO level. And this is very important, yeah. And that does not legitimize the nowadays broader definition of the USA to say that providing the USA with steel from many parts of the world or even with cars, that we are threatening the national security. Yeah? So that's a different thing. We have to differentiate. When it comes to the question of different blocks or a more and more separated world, maybe. I start from the angle of the German businesses. Our approach is a as well as approach. We are in many countries in the world. We are only dependent of 9% when it comes to our export destination countries, 9% to the USA. This is our largest export market. 9%.
9%.
9%, not more, not less. Maybe a bit less, even less. Yeah, then we have France. In former times we had the UK. They rank now 5. They have been 3, but this is due to the Brexit. That's another issue. And we have good experience doing trade and changing things in the direction what we have liked. Yeah, look at the example of the Soviet Union. There was a change by trade. Germany advanced his trade with the Soviet Union, Western Germany in the 70s, 80s, and maybe this is one of the explanations why things have improved in the Soviet Union later on, and now we call it Russia. So, and I'm not convinced that Russia is really a warlord when it comes to trade policy. I do think we have now 3 major players, and one is the US, the other is China, and this is maybe the most important one, and the third is the European Union, but we are not really unified in that. And, but from our perspective, we are now forced more and more, due to the pressure of the USA, to say an either or. Either with us or with China. Either with us or with Iran and the nuclear deal. Either with us or with Russia. There are sanctions coming from the USA against Russia when it comes to the project of Nord Stream 2, which is for gas providing project for Europe and for Germany. So we are complaining about that, but we are working on that, and so I support your view when it comes to the question that we get more and more divided into different trade warlords. Yeah, okay, I have my doubts.
Just a second, Stefan, I'm going to have you finish your comments. Can we bring the lights up and then get the hands up so we can get the numbers? We have hands here and here. Please, it's just move quickly. We have somebody in the second row. Yeah, there. Please. And then let's get a second microphone to the person in the third row with his hands up with number 4. Let's get the microphones in their hands so we can do it quickly. Stefan.
A very small, short comment, because Your Excellency will certainly comment on that. Sorry, also. We are all concentrating on tariffs problem, but the real issue for business is access to markets. That's a real issue. And I think we are sometimes missing up the point. I mean, tariffs are relatively low worldwide, and that was the achievement of the GATT and the World Trade Organization and the various rounds. Today, the real issue, if you look at China, if you look at the rest, is really access to markets. And I think, Your Excellency, you have done a lot of things here in you.
Yes, I think this is very important. You know, I mean, the idea here is it has changed. Actually, the GATT, even the name, it included tariffs, you know, inside the name of the GATT itself. But now what's happening, you know, here really, you know, what do you call it, encouraging access to the market. And I think the competition between economies there is how to make it easy for, you know, foreign companies to access the market. And actually, ourselves here in Qatar, we have come again a long way, you know, in terms of that one. We just recently we have, you know, we're going to be passing, you know, a law that will allow 100% foreign ownership of companies here. We're building the duty-free zone, you know, itself, and this is going to be 35 million square meters of land available for, you know, free investment and free trade of, you know, of free movement of commodities, even whether, you know, for building, you know, a local manufacturer, or you want to export or re-export itself. You know, also, you know, we're, you know, also we're, you know, changing, you know, the laws in Qatar, around the Qatar Financial Center. We're kind of allowing more companies. We have actually achieved 66% increase of companies registering in Qatar Financial Center itself. You know,
excuse me, 66%. How long of a period?
Over 1 year.
In 1 year?
This is during the blockade.
Wow.
Itself. So, I mean, in terms of like, you know, the foreign ownership, you know, I mean, and in terms of like, you know, encouraging companies here, we want to really position Qatar as a major trading hub, you know, for many companies, whether to do business in Qatar itself or to do it with other countries as well out of Qatar. So, I mean, the idea here is really to encourage them, not only from a tariffs point of view, but, you know, really from an ease of business doing here. Qatar has opened, you know, 80 visa systems, you know, 80 countries that can come to Qatar without visa. This is what Qatar number 8 in the world in terms of like, you know, easy easy entry, you know, and based on United Nations, you know, statistics, based on World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness, you know, report for 2018. Qatar ranked number 1 in terms of like low inflation rate, number 6 in terms of like ease of paying taxes, number 8 in terms of you know, availability of venture capital, and number 9th in terms of you know, SME financing.
Great. Okay, let's take the questions from the floor. Number 2, and then we had one over here in 4. Number 2, please. If you can stand up, the microphones will work. Just identify yourself and one person on the panel.
No, for the whole panelists. So thanks for the panelists who are expressing the point of view of rich. We are the poor have other point of view about international trade and FDI. Unfair, unjust, unbalanced, controlled by multinationals, which are belonging to the rich. So FDI and pricing is going in favor of them. By the way, the commodities items of rich is soaring high, while the commodities and items of poor is going down, decreasing. I give example. OPEC exporting 32 million barrels a day. They can't export derivatives because this is, the advanced countries located refineries there. So they are deprived of the added value, which I say there are illegal trade, drugs, prostitution, human trafficking, and we can do the arms trade. So we have to put in consideration about this. It's enough. I think he's looking to me, John, so I don't like to take it. There is a lot to say.
I know.
It is enough.
I didn't get a question out of that, though. What was the question?
The question, how can we make the trade an FDI? FDI, this is the foreign direct investment. They didn't speak about investment, which is directed to the rich countries. How can we make this in favor of the poor like us?
Okay, very good. Professor Gorelli, I think it's a good one for you.
Why me? I think...
Dr. Trier's ready. I can see him. He's ready
it's okay. I will be brief.
He's loaded for bear. I can see he's got like a shotgun in his
I will
hands.
be brief. I understand your concern. You will have to define now who are the rich. The rich are not only the US and Europe. It becomes increasingly China, increasingly many companies in the Gulf regions, etc. Sorry. I think that those who are going to make the things change is going to be the civil society. It's going to be all these pressure groups which are rising a bit everywhere around the world in favor of the environment, in favor of more transparency, in favor of sustainable development. They are going to make change much faster than we thought, and they're already putting a lot of pressure today. I give just one example, and then I will give my colleagues a chance to answer this very interesting question. Take Shell in the oil business. They have said now they want to reduce drastically, and they have precise objective on reducing carbon dioxide emission, because they feel the pressure at every General Assembly of shareholders of people coming in and say, what are you going to do? And this we can see everywhere. So if there is a hope that things are going to change, it will come from civil society.
Dr. Trier?
I would like to give an answer from the perspective of the bulk of German industries. It's the SMEs, what we call the Mittelstand.
Yeah.
There is such a huge potential that many of those companies could even create more jobs, could even invest even more FDIs in poor countries like we have it nowadays. We are working with that means European free trade agreements in order to lower the access to markets also for the FDIs. We are so many times asked about how can you bring those companies to our countries, because they know those countries, they come to stay and to be part of that society.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even when we have in the Middle East, I've seen groups of German, groups of Italian, groups of French SMIs, to Stefan's point, coming together not as a single company, but to come as an entity and say, we're ready to play. And I think that's the opportunity. I mean, we're looking at FDI, global FDI of more than $1 trillion every year, and it's not all going into the Western world, that's for sure.
Yeah. And that's also bringing, because you mentioned it right at the right beginning, to bring the apprenticeships, their experiences, how to qualify the young people in order to be part of
create jobs.
In their plan.
Okay, we had number 4, I think, or just do number 4 and number 3, and then we'll wrap it up. I ask you to be direct, if you can, please.
Thank you, Mr. Defarsos. I just have an opinion to express and have a sort of request.
Okay, I hope it's a quick opinion.
It is a very quick opinion, very quick opinion. Thank you. You raised a very good issue. Can we do better without USA? I don't know, but I think it's worth trying. And to support my opinion, I have Qatar as a case. Who would have thought 2 years ago that Qatar could have done much better than before? His Excellency has raised that they perform in 18 months much more than they could have performed in 20 years. I'm a doctor by practice, and I thought that adrenaline sometimes can raise the performance under stress. But could Qatar adrenaline last for 2 years or 3 years? That's a point, okay? So I would like really to think, to request His Excellency to give us the chance to look into could countries perform much better when they feel, I'm sorry to say, to use this word, when they feel that they are under threat or even under stress. That's only my request. Thank you.
That's an excellent point, and a point I wanted to bring up. You're growing about 3%. Some even are suggesting 4% in 2019. I'm going to ask you to do it in 30 seconds, though. What happens after the World Cup spending, though? Because you have an elixir in the system, which is infrastructure spending, which is feeding growth. You know, post 2022, you'll have a challenge. Is it correct?
Well, I will answer your question, and also, going back. I think the issue, first of all, going performing under stress or under pressure, I think the stress and the pressure is over now, and we are now in the growth mode. We're in the thinking of what we do next. So we have gone and we have proven our resilience in terms of dealing, with the pressure and the stress we had, in the early days of the blockade. So going forward, I think we are in the growth mode. We're not looking back, and how we can see the opportunities. So we see the opportunities. Even the 2022 is only one stop, in the Qatar journey. And if I can tell you, in terms of we have the 2030 vision, which is the most important things for us in terms of diversification and moving away from hydrocarbon-based economy to knowledge-based economy. To me, this is the most important. And this is the longer journey for Qatar, investing in health, education, sport, and opening up the country, for tourism, for businesses, for trade, for manufacturing. This is the longer term journey, and this is not coming only from the blockade. This is already there. All what I said, during the blockade we have accelerated because we saw opportunities to move fast in certain fields. Don't forget also the other, there is a huge investment coming in the area of Qatar because we're upgrading our NGL, exportation and production by 40%, reaching 110 million tons per annum. This is itself going to require huge investment, and this is going to happen over 6 to 7 years from today. So we have many, journeys, and looking, NGL is the future of the world in terms of
the gas and liquids technology.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you quickly because I promised number 4 to make a comment. Is there a comment there for 4? Do we have a microphone there or not for the gentleman? You have to move very quickly. I thought his hands would have the mic. And then we'll wrap it up now. Yeah? Thank you. Please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate what Qatar has done so far.
Are you the gentleman who just asked the question?
Yes.
Oh, you're very tricky. I didn't think you were going to take it twice.
Sorry. I appreciate your point, but can you give me a minute just to
Your first question was so good we gave you the mic second time. That's impossible. 30 seconds and we have to close. Thank you.
What I think that really Qatar must have had very sound infrastructure, and maybe they were waiting for the right point or the right moment. And I'm from Kuwait, so we usually say as Arabs, رُبَّ ضَارَّةٍ نَافِعَةٍ, something which you might have hate could have been in your favor. So I really request that I hope though in positive way that this experience could be repeated all over the world,
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You get a bonus. I think you have to pay the minister for the extra question from the floor. Thanks for your patience. I'm sorry for the other, because we could have taken a lot more questions, but we're out of time. Your Excellency, thanks for forming the panel. Dr. Trier, nice to meet you, and Professor Gorelli, good to see you again. Nice round of applause for our panelists here today.